Hello everybody, this is Markus from hyperloquian.com, and today I'm thrilled to show you my conversation with one of the greats of the mandolin, Mr. Mike Marshall. But before we start with the interview, I would like to ask you for a favor. It would be cool if you could subscribe to the hyperloquian.com YouTube channel. There's great interviews with amazing people coming in the near future. Also make sure to check out the website itself, hyperloquian.com. Anyways, thanks. And now, without further ado, here's Mr. Mike Marshall.
Can we talk a bit about your beginnings?
I was actually born in Pennsylvania in the north, and my heritage is Italian, actually. The name Marshall was changed. It used to be Masciariello many, many years ago. My great-grandfather came over. Anyway, we moved to Florida when I was about 12, and that's when I got into playing guitar. I just took lessons from the fellow down the street at the local music store. And I was very fortunate because he played all of the different string instruments, and he knew a lot about traditional music, bluegrass and folk and blues and all of these things. And so from the very beginning, I had this nice wide variety of education. He made sure that I learned to read music and played some classical guitar, but also started a bluegrass band with some of his fellow students, and we, formed this group, and it was all playing by ear, and I played mandolin, and they had banjo and guitar and bass, and we went around to the bluegrass festivals, a teenage bluegrass band called the Sunshine Bluegrass Boys, and that's what introduced me to traditional American music, was actually going to these events and hanging out with the real Southerners who owned this music. And this was a very exciting time for acoustic music in America because the movie Deliverance had come out. I don't know if you remember that movie. It had banjo and guitars in it. And the album Will the Circle Be Unbroken by the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band also made a kind of explosion into the pop world, really. It was on the best-selling charts. And Dueling Banjos was a radio hit on the radio. So it kind of drew people back to their American music and made it popular and hip again, especially amongst young people and urban people. So it was much the same as Oh Brother, Where Art Thou did more recently, sort of drew attention to our great traditional music. So that was sort of what got me into it, and one thing led to another, and I started meeting all the greats who play that music. The first festival I went to, for instance, J.D. Crowe and the New South were there with Tony Rice on guitar and Ricky Skaggs on fiddle, Jerry Douglas on dobro. Marty Stewart was there playing with Lester Flatt. The Country Gentlemen, the Seldom Seen, the Osborne Brothers, Jim and Jesse, Ralph Stanley, Doc Watson, all of them. And so I just kind of got thrust into this, came back with a stack of LPs, and just started learning the music mostly by ear, the way it was done then, before YouTubes and whatnot, before internet. I became particularly interested in what contemporary bluegrass people were doing, people who were stretching the boundaries. And there was a band called the Newgrass Revival that caught my attention, and Sam Bush was the mandolin player, and he became a bit of a hero of mine. And our bluegrass band, when I think back on it, was almost a Newgrass Revival cover band by the end. We were playing all of their material, and I was learning all of his solos off of those records. And so, that was my initial inspiration. Will the Circle Be Unbroken was an incredible record because Vassar Clements was playing fiddle, and I also learned fiddle during that time. Earl Scruggs was on the banjo. So, John Hartford's first records were coming out. His record Steam Powered Airplane was really forward thinking in terms of bringing other elements into the music. And certainly that was what Sam Bush was doing. There were some folks in New York, Tony Trischka, Andy Statman, Russ Barenberg, that were doing this sort of New York urban version of bluegrass, if you would. It's just a great, exciting time period to Bluegrass. Bill Monroe and all the guys who were in his band were playing the festival, but also these newer, younger people were introducing other elements to the American string band idea. It started with guitar, but the teacher I had played mandolin and banjo and fiddle and bass and introduced me to all the different string instruments. So, and the idea of reading music and learning theory as well as playing by ear and, just jamming and improvising. So from the beginning, I kind of had both things happening, which I've always been grateful. His name was Jim Hilligoss. I've always been grateful to Jim for kind of hipping me to the fact that all of these different musical styles are great and worth studying, and to be able to learn music this way or that way has a lot of value in it.
So being both a multi-instrumentalist and being at home in various styles has been something that's been with you since the beginning then, right?
Yes, I would have to say. Of course, as time went on, I discovered many more styles beyond what Jim had introduced me to. There's a natural inclination for us bluegrass pickers to be attracted to gypsy jazz and Django Reinhardt and Stephen Grappelli. So I found myself down that rabbit hole for a long period. One of the most influential bands of American acoustic music was the David Grisman Quintet. And when their first record came out, I really just ate it up and became kind of obsessed. David was a really a musicologist, if you will. He's always been interested in music from everywhere, all over the world. Very hip to jazz and classical music as well, but he knew as much about traditional American music as anybody. So he formed this band, and Tony Rice joined the group, the great guitarist who just passed on last year. And I knew Tony from his work with J.D. Crowe, and I'd actually met him at some festivals. And Tony told David about me. He said, there's this young kid in Florida who's really great. And David had started a mandolin magazine at the time that he started his band, a little pamphlet that came out 4 times a year. He thought that having a magazine would support his artistic endeavors. Of course, the opposite happened. The band actually produced the magazine. Daryl Anger was the fiddler, and Todd Phillips was also the mandolin player and later became the bass player. Bill Amotnick was on bass. And the record they put out, their first album, the David Grisman Quintet, was just tremendous. It just leapfrogged over probably 10 years of musical development in one recording. And all of us acoustic music buffs just kind of gravitated towards it and went crazy. And it was just one of those, what the hell is this moments for acoustic music. And I was fortunate enough to have known Tony. He told David about me, and I just called David on the phone one day and ordered a whole bunch of the LPs and a bunch of the mandolin magazines, and kind of befriended him and said, I love this music. And he said, if you're ever out in California, come on over and we'll jam. So my sister was living in Las Vegas. I flew to Las Vegas in August or something, and the next day we drove to California, and I showed up at David's house, and all the guys were there, and I was already playing the music. I knew all the tunes, which to me seemed really normal, on all the instruments too. So they immediately just said, you're in the band, you got it, you're one of us, you're crazy for this stuff like we are. So David was in the middle of a soundtrack to a movie, The King of the Gypsies. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it featured Stephen Grappelli playing violin, and he hired Stephen to play on the soundtrack. And so the week that I showed up, the next week they were about to go to LA to finish recording that music with Stefan and an 80-piece orchestra. And he said, "Do you want to come on down?" David was having some tendonitis problems. He said, "You can play all the rhythm parts for me that are causing me trouble in my hand." And so that was mind-blowing experience I was 19 years old. This was in 1978. So, the top of my head came off and I was just thrust into this amazing experience to be playing with my heroes and then playing with Stefan Grappelli, who didn't even realize was still with us. I thought of him as somebody that was recording in the 30s. He kind of disappeared for a while and then resurfaced in the late 70s playing that music that he had played with Django. And it was just unbelievable. So I went back to Florida and packed up everything and came and moved in with Tony Rice and started hanging with those guys. And that was just like that was like graduate school for me, on every level in terms of learning about timing and tone and how to play in a band and how to be in a recording studio and how to write music and all of it. David was an incredible mentor and had an incredible collection of records, and we would just go over there and listen to everything from John Coltrane to Japanese shakuhachi to Brazilian bandolin. And it's a real eye-opener and real educational and continues to be kind of the source whereby everything I do today kind of grew out of. Those 5 years with David introduced me to Daryl. That started a long-term relationship that many things spun out of because we became neighbors, just played music all day and all night. We were on tour with David, and when we would come home, we would write our own music and think about, we got to do our own thing someday, man. So it was an exciting period.
What was it like to be on stage as a young man with those older cats and quite famous? What was the first time you stood on stage like?
Well, I remember the first time actually playing together in the living room with Tony, David, Todd, and Daryl, and that was the most intense, magical thing I'd ever experienced. It was like flying, is how I'd like to describe it, because the rhythm, the sense of rhythm that those guys have, especially with Tony on guitar. I mean, the kind of lift that you got when he started playing rhythm is unlike anything. He passed on last Christmas, December 25th, and I mean, you can watch and listen to lots of interviews from all the great musicians who got to play with Tony, and they all say the same thing, that when Tony hit the rhythm, something happened. It elevated, everything elevated, and it also got super focused on the details. But it was also like driving a sports car and taking corners really easily. And it wasn't metronomic, it was buoyant and floating, and yet it was perfect. Probably the way jazz musicians talk about Jack DeJohnette or Roy Haynes or Elvin Jones. What's it like to be with that guy like that driving the truck? You know, it's a ride, man. It's a ride. And, you know, with him gone, it's gone. No one can do what he did. And with David on, you know, his sense of writing tunes and leading a band, and being able to corral all these tremendously talented musicians and get them focused on something was his skill, you know, to get us to actually play the arrangement, make the stop where the stop happened, and play 2 choruses, not 20, you know, these kind of band leader things. He was great at. He also knew how to negotiate the music business. He had a manager. He knew about record labels, and promoters, and the dark side of the music business. He could navigate us through all of that and protect us so we could just be creative musicians. And so there was a lot I was learning. But, being on stage with those guys, the first gig I ever played, I was in the band, which was 1979, 78, going into 79, I think. 2 nights at the Great American Music Hall. And then, 3 months later, we were on tour with Stefan Grappelli. And shit, what can you say about that? Stefan. I mean, it's a guy who was probably 75 years old. We were all 20 to 30. I have to laugh because David called himself the old man in the band. Your old dad, he called himself. There's Stefan, just as David describes it, throwing lightning bolts at us every solo he took. It was like just burying us young punks with elegance and finesse and harmonic understanding and rhythmic virtuosity and interest and soul, all the things you want to hear. That was stuff. So Mark O'Connor was on guitar for that tour, touring with Mark and learning about the whole Texas fiddle tradition through him. I mean, it's like, it's definitely pinch yourself kind of experiences to get to have. There's no question. Always grateful to have gotten to play with all the cats I've gotten to play with.
I wanted to ask you about Bluegrass. Looking at your discography, you've always had a very progressive approach, a very stylistic. You combined elements, you combine musical worlds. Now, Bluegrass used to be also kind of a conservative before the Newgrass revival. That the Bluegrass players were very puristic and conservative. What was the status like of Bluegrass when you grew up and when you discovered it?
Well, I think it's important to understand the origins of bluegrass first. If we go back to the early American string bands, I mean, everything in America is this mixture at its inception. You have our British Isles music colliding with African drumming. That's pretty much it. The African syncopations and rhythms that came out of the blues. That's why it's called bluegrass. And mixed with the Irish fiddling music and all the English ballads and Irish songs. The early bluegrass musicians, I believe that the reason bluegrass was born was because these hillbilly people who lived way out in the country, it was because of radio. Radio came to them in the 20s, and they were hearing all of a sudden urban music. They were hearing Benny Goodman, and they were hearing classical music, and they were hearing all this other music, Caruso or what have you, on the radio. And so they took their string band instruments, and it was a fusion from the beginning, is my point. What Bill Monroe did was extremely modern. And what Earl Scruggs did to the banjo was the same thing that Bela Fleck did to the banjo. And what Chris Thile did to the mandolin is what Bill Monroe did to the mandolin. When you relate it to the people who played before them in a very folksy, simple, laid back, not very fast way, these guys were hot rodding the music and bringing elements of jazz into it, believe it or not, even though they didn't know jazz or study it. You can see the influence. If you interviews with people like Benny Martin, he would say, yeah, they were hearing Joe Venuti and Stefan Grappelli. They didn't have any idea how to play that music, but the idea of hot fiddle is a thing in old time music. And if you look at the Texas fiddle tradition, they were hearing swing and jazz coming over the radio from New Orleans. And so that changed Texas fiddle music and made it more swing oriented. And so to me, it's just a continuum, that hasn't really stopped. What happened in the 70s was a big explosion because of all these urban people, people from the north and the big cities. And David Grisman's one of them, Tony Trischka. Bela Fleck comes from New York. The 60s gave us this interest in American traditional music and folk music, and it was people like Ralph Renzler, the great musicologist, who worked for Smithsonian Institute or Folkways Records, and went down to the South and discovered Bill Monroe and discovered Doc Watson and brought him to, Gertie's Folk City and all these folk clubs in New York, and helped him tour around the upper cities, the northern cities, introducing them to the college-age kids. So college kids found out about this music in the 60s. And so when they got interested in it, they started bringing other elements because they grew up, with a whole other set of influences. So naturally, they're going to do that. I think what happened to bluegrass is that it goes through periods of expansion and contraction. There's periods when folks are really kind of honing in and saying, no, this is bluegrass. From this date to this date is real bluegrass, and then anything after that is contemporary, right? And then not acceptable, quote unquote. And so it's kind of a silly idea, because to me it's always changing and it's always evolving. As a musician, you can choose to play a certain period, just like in jazz. You have people who play a particular era of jazz and are not interested in, or say classical music. You have Baroque music specialists who want to just play the period instruments and try and get as close as they can to that. That's, I admire it. And I certainly have an arm reaching back to the traditions. And I grew out of it and I understand it. But it's not 100% where my heart is. My ideas of music making has always been to see where we could go with the music next, both in terms of technically what was possible on the instrument, and then to expand our embrace and to embrace classical music and world music from, well, I don't like that term, but music from all these other places, which led me to having such an interest in Brazilian choro music and other Latin styles, music from the East, Bulgarian music, and all the music from the Balkans. I love it. Pop music, the Beatles, Little Feat, Allman Brothers, all that stuff. I'm crazy about it. But I'm an acoustic musician primarily. So I think you just have to find where you're comfortable, There are some people who want to sound like the Bluegrass Album Band. To them, that's the pinnacle of what bluegrass can be and should be. I'm inclined to agree with them. That is a very high level of a bluegrass band. That is pretty much it. But it doesn't sound, it's not Bill Monroe, it's not Lester Flatt singing, it's not Benny Martin on the fiddle, but it's a very refined version of that music that those guys created, and they just took it to another level. They didn't expand on it in the same way that Sam Bush did with the Newgrass Revival. They didn't introduce other rhythmic elements or long improvisational solos or any of that. They just refined the tradition. But that's not me. I'm not a great enough singer to be... I think bluegrass is really a singing style. 90% of it is singing. And so I always thought, well, I'd rather hear Tim O'Brien and Ricky Skaggs than Mike Marshall.
when I listen through your whole discography, and when you listen to your earlier works, like also the duo with Daryl Anger, or I hope I pronounced it right, Chiaroscuro, on Windmill, which is an amazing record too. One can't help but think that you knew quite from the beginning of your recording career where you wanted to go. Is that a true suspicion?
Yeah, that's really pretty much it. If I look at that record or Gator Strut, and I think about a mandolin quartet I did on Gator Strut, 2 mandolins, mandola, mandocello. I mean, I had a dream to do it. Later, I would find them, and we formed the Modern Mandolin Quartet and made 3 records for Windham Hill. But yeah, the solo Bach on the duo record with Daryl, there it is. That's me exploring that music as a mandolin player. There was no place to study classical mandolin in America at that time. Still isn't, really, not at the conservatory level. So I just did it myself. We recorded Donna Lee, Daryl and I. We were interested in learning jazz. We loved it. We would go and see all the jazz greats that came to San Francisco. And so we wanted to learn to play that music. And at that time, there was David Baker and Jamie Abersol, the great educators, had their once-a-year camp at Stanford University, and Daryl and I would go down there and hang out for a day with David and come back with the exercise books. And the real book was illegal at that time, and we were buying copies of it out of the back of people's cars and coming home and trying to figure out what a sharp 11 chord was and what's a sharp 9 on a mandolin. How can you do that? We don't have enough strings. What voicing am I going to use to recreate that sound? There's a great violinist, Dave Balakrishnan, that Daryl started Turtle Island String Quartet at the same time, and Dave knew a little bit more about how jazz harmony worked than we did. And so my thing has always been about just educating myself, really. I've just wanted to learn more and more and more. To me, that's what music really is. It's a study. And it doesn't stop because it's such a gigantic ocean. You can never find the bottom of it or, corral the whole thing. You have to make choices about how much of it you're going to be able to really take in your life. And so, I've picked a certain couple of avenues to go down in hopes that they would influence my own compositions, and I believe they have. If you look at an album like Chiaroscuro, that was clearly, influenced by everything that I just talked about, plus Pat Metheny and Weather Report and all the great fusion groups that were doing things, McLaughlin, doing things with odd meters and improvising over simple chords, maybe, and trying to learn to build a solo over a long period of time. Those were all things we were learning from those kind of groups. Yeah.
But it was definitely pioneer work that you've done also for the mandolin and jazz. As you said, the styles flow in one into each other. But what was the status of mandolin in jazz? You said there weren't too many. You had to figure out yourself how to play a ninth chord on instrument.
Yeah. There was Jethro Burns, of course, coming more from the swing side of things, and we were just discovering him for the first time at that time, because those records that he had put out he put out 2 records with Homer, his partner, that were non-comedy records, that were instrumental jazz records, and they weren't even available at that time. We had cassettes of them. But there wasn't much that you could learn from. You couldn't go to Berklee School of Music as a mandolin player. If I was that age now, that's probably where I would have ended up, like many of the young people have. It's a great place to study. I mean, you've got Matt Glazer and Daryl Anger was teaching there the last 5 years or more. And then you meet each other. You meet all the other students and you form groups and all that, juicy stuff happens. There was none of that available to us. We had to dig it out ourselves. When I think about ordering a Newgrass Revival album and waiting 6 weeks for it to arrive in Lakeland, Florida at the local music store, finally putting the needle on the record and just and then living with it for the next 6 months and learning every note, even the mistakes. That kind of obsession is, to a degree, is bred from not having access and having that yearning for, give me, where is it? And I almost feel sorry for young people today that don't even want to buy a CD, because it's like, why should I? Everything's so available. And maybe not having the passion because they have so much access. It's a little bit ho-hum, all this. I mean, I'm still fired up. I get excited when I discover something on YouTube and it sends me down a rabbit hole. So I'm all for it. I don't want to be the grumpy old man. But I know how deep in I dove into just a few things that I could get my hands on. And the same with Brazilian choro. That music I discovered, David Grisman had a cassette of Jacob de Mandolin, and he would play it in the van when we toured around, and we didn't know what we were hearing. The mandolin sounded different than an F5. There was all this percussion. We'd never heard of a pandeiro or any of the instruments from Brazil. The 7-string guitar, we heard these bass lines, and we were like, man, that bass player is playing really busy and sometimes really high. What's going on? And a cavaquinho we'd never seen. So it would be 10 years later before I would go to Brazil with Daryl Anger and the Turtle Island Quartet and discover this style and say, oh my God, it's just like bluegrass. It kind of lives under the radar a little bit. And it's a virtuosic style, and it's obsessed by a small community of people. And here they are at this little cafe in the Italian district playing on the street for 5 or 6 people. It's like, this is my stuff, man. This is just like being in North Carolina, only different. It's the roots of Brazilian music in many ways, and the best players come from this style. It's not pop music. It's about the music, it's about the playing, not the hairstyles. So I really took to it and came back with stacks of CDs and music books and dove in for 2 or 3 years. I didn't do anything but play choro, learn the tunes, and obsess about which tunes were more popular than others. That led down another well.
But so the availability of everything is a two-sided sword in that sense.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I can ask myself, what's the second chord that Mike Marshall plays on Tennessee Waltz? I go into the internet and I have it in 2 seconds, and I can look at your hand in close up, which is another good thing.
It's unfair.
It's unfair,
really
yeah.
Unfair. I mean, we wanted to see the Newgrass Revival, the guitarist in my bluegrass band, and so we drove 15 hours to Bowling Green, Kentucky, because they never came to Florida. They did once, but it wasn't a regular part of their tour route. So we, just showed up at the club. We were too young to get in. And I went backstage and met Sam, and he got us like a stamp so we could get in, but we weren't allowed to order drinks. So that passion, it was, you have to find that somehow in today's world. Hopefully people do. I mean, I'm sure they do, because there's great young players out there, and they're writing their own music, and they have bands, and they're fired up.
I mean,
Germany's a little different.
In what way? Yeah, let's talk about Germany. Like you're living half of your time in Germany and half of your time in San Francisco, right? When the pandemic allows it, at least, to travel around.
So for those of you who don't know, I'm married to Katharina Lichtenberg, a great classical mandolinist who has what is arguably the only position in a music conservatory for classical mandolin here in Wuppertal. And so, that changed both of our lives quite a bit. But it brings us here when she has her teaching schedule, and then we keep our place in Oakland, California. But, here I am living in a foreign place where the music that I grew up on and so passionate about, is a very small slice of the pie, and it's challenging to find people who are interested in it. Of course, I have. We used to play the Telluride Bluegrass Festival back in Colorado. And he would come there, and whenever we would do a workshop in town, he would come up to me and buy stuff from me out of the back of the car, CDs and books and things. And I always thought, oh, there's that German guy again, buying more stuff and always bothering me for things. And I move here, and it turns out he lives in this town. His music store is right in Wuppertal. And so we've become really close friends. We get together with our families, and I'm hanging out at his store all the time. I'm always joking with him. He's trying to always sell me a new banjo, Oliver Weitza is his name. So he's introduced me to some other pickers in the area, and we've done some gigs and things. But, what I do is kind of out of context here when I thinking about, especially in terms of Katharina's students at the conservatory, who came out of the plucked music world, the Zupf orchestra world of Germany, where you have mandolin orchestras with mandolins and guitars, and everybody's in a big orchestra, 20 to 50 people, reading music and playing these arrangements. And the mandolin is a very different instrument. It's a bowback instrument, and what they aspire to and what they learn is not how to play a flat 9 chord and not how to improvise and play fiddle tunes. So I'm like this crazy anomaly here, this weirdo from America. But it's pretty cool because the director of the music conservatory 2 years ago said, Mike, you got to teach a class here. It's ridiculous that you're living in town and you're not part of our faculty and presenting something to the students. And so I started a class, and it's an improvisation class and a mostly Brazilian choro we play a lot of. I find that's a great entrance way in for classical musicians because to sight read that music is challenging. You've got to really be on your game. It's rhythmically challenging and fairly notey. And so even if you're not an improviser, you can be part of the fun and play the tune and get a feeling for the groove. But what I do is I sneak in little improvisations and I make them improvise once the groove is happening. And that's very scary for classical musicians, of course, because if you've never improvised, first of all, you freeze, and you don't know what to play. You just, it's an E minor scale and you play an E note, but then what, The mandolin in that tradition here is not considered a chord instrument. So that's also a big hurdle for mandolin players, is to see A minor 7 and know where to find it. They just don't know harmony on their own instrument. They can sight read anything. They can play Bach solo stuff. Even the guitar players in the conservatory, you tell them B7 and they're like, wow, let me see. They didn't really grow up on the Beatles like our generation, where you just play songs and you learn 3 chords and you learn 4 or 5 keys. And it seems so natural coming from an American perspective on mandolin and guitar, but it's not taught that way here. And I'm kind of scratching my head, because some of these students are master students about to graduate, and they do not know an A minor 7 flat 5. They never had to do that. And I think it's a missed opportunity in the education system here. I think that so I'm waving the flag, I'm come on, you guys, and so we've had some good progress, actually. I've turned some students on, and some of them really dove in and are up for it. And it's improving their classical playing. Katerina tells me straight up. She says, wow, that guy, since he's been taking your class, his time got so good, and he really plays the music with a lot more of ownership and soul and feeling, It's a different way of, it's amazing to me that we're so far down the road in terms of being open to different musics and people from around the world. And yet, sometimes music education is very divided, and there's a very particular path you have to go, and that's it. And they don't embrace like I have. But I had to, That was the only way to survive in America. Here you could follow that path of, okay, I'm just a classical guitarist. I'm going to graduate from this conservatory, and I'm going to go and teach in the local music stores, and I'll get a position, and that'll be that. There's no option like that in America. There's no community music center that's going to give you a job. You can teach privately or at a local music store privately. Certainly no professor positions available for mandolin players anyway. So most of us have had to be creative and had to be have that knife in your back and come up with projects and come up with bands and go on the road and do the thing that's going to pay the rent, or do the variety of things that are going to enable you to be a musician. It's not thought of that way here, I don't think.
I mean, I was surprised you did an interview with your colleague Sam Bush a couple of years ago, where you asked him when the last time was that he toured Germany. And he said, I think once with Emmylou Harris, which kind of surprised me because, I mean, people...
This guy's a national treasure.
But why do you think that is? Because country is well known over here too in Europe? And
yeah, well, there's the problem of country and bluegrass. They're really two separate things.
Yeah.
And I see it all the time, as soon as I get the mandolin out and start playing a bluegrass tune, the Germans' perception of it is country music, Johnny Cash, and or it's something like Oh Susanna, it's like as deep as they can go, because they just don't know what that is. What is that music? It's a subgroup within an American culture, bluegrass. I mean, Sam Bush is a hero to all of us, and he's a rock star. But in country music, he's not. He doesn't get played on country radio, And so Germany's perception would be, well, who's the latest country music star? Let's get them over here. It's really different. It's not unlike the Brazilian music. These guys like Hamilton de Holanda. I mean, in Brazil, he's playing to 2,000 people. When he comes to San Francisco, maybe a couple hundred, and it's a small folk club, and it's mandolin players. So that's just a social problem that I hope will get fixed someday. But yeah, when you're living in another place, yeah, you grow up with your perception of what is big time. It's not necessarily once you cross that border.
Yeah.
So luckily, I've been able to continue my career there and still live here part time. And you know, there's a lot of great things about being here, of course. Raising kids and school, healthcare, and all those things are so wonderful. And it's funny because Katerina and I joke about it, because for her, that sense of security that you get from living in Germany is so important. And I'm like, I never knew about that. I come from America. But I see the pros and cons of both. I see how the music business in America forces people like Sarah Jarosz, Sierra Hall, Tim O'Brien. They write all this incredible music. Such a gift, to have all this productivity and all this creativity. And it's just not on the radar for a lot of classical musicians to even think about doing that. Well, they don't write their own music, for one thing. So it's, but even coming up with a project that's somehow new and innovative, you have e-music and music, So you have this immediate kind of prejudice. We've been able to kind of bring those two worlds together in America much more, because jazz has elevated itself to a high art form and has gotten the respect with Lincoln Center Jazz and Wynton Marsalis and all the work that that generation has done. Now you have even bluegrass people like Yo-Yo Ma and Chris Thiele and Edgar Meyer and myself, Bela Fleck, and we did a project with Joshua Bell, fusing these worlds, which to me is the most beautiful thing about what America does best. That we're not afraid of that. Those two things can coexist and actually elevate both and broaden both.
Which is probably to do with the fact that America has been a melting pot since day one anyways, right?
Yeah, we don't have that fixed 300-year tradition that we're trying to uphold and make sure it's preserved,
And is it bothering you about Europe a bit or about Germany a bit? That, everything's quite...
sometimes I get in the faces of the students, the young students, and come on, man, you gotta get this together. How you gonna get a gig if you don't know B7?
Yeah.
But they're like, I already have a gig, or I don't know. It's the needs are different in both places. But I rant and rave, and because I'm just passionate about people learning everything. I want them to just learn, because I think it's great to expand. But yeah, you do have this tradition, and what I love about being here is that I get to really explore it, and living with Katerina and learning about Baroque music in particular. And I've gone deep down that rabbit hole with her, and every day is a learning experience, seeing the students play even. And I got kind of obsessed reading things like Stefan Zweig and Klemperer and the people who Arthur Rubinstein's early years. I really love this period of Europe before World War One. That kind of glorious end of the Victorian era, leading into So I've learned so much about history, being living here and having an interest in seeing it all around you, all the time. It led me to do a bit of studying myself.
But not only being a musician, but being an educator.
Well,
That's what I mean. What you talked about, that you encourage students to, I don't know, learn E7 flat 9 or improvise. That's what you're basically also doing together with Katerina on ArtistWorks, right? Because you're having the Bluegrass course, which is, of course, not only Bluegrass. She's having the classical course, and it kind of intermingles.
yeah, totally.
Have you seen?
We have students who are on both, you know, and so they go to her for classical and they go to me for the other things. It's a beautiful format. I mean, for those of you who don't know what it is, they invented this thing called a video exchange, in which, you know, you can watch me teaching a tune or a technique, but you can also send me a video of yourself playing a tune. And we provide all these backing tracks and stuff. And then I watch your video, and then I create a response to that and tell you some of the things you could improve. And then these two videos get put on the site as a video exchange. And so you can watch the student and then watch what I have to say about it. So if you're too shy, you can still see, you know, a masterclass setting one-on-one and take some of that in yourself. See, wow, am I doing that? You know, it's a really hip, amazing thing. Because, I mean, you can learn a lot of stuff on YouTube. All this stuff is out there. Like we said earlier, if you want to learn Blackberry Blossom, there's 150 guys teaching it on YouTube. But I got to say, until somebody sends me a video, they could have been on the site for 10 years. Until I see that first video, it's very hard for them to correct themselves and do the things that I would want them to do. For some reason, I think I'm the same way. We can't really see what we're doing when we're doing it, you know, because we're so focused here and here. And then when somebody points out, you know, you're holding your thumb kind of like this, and this finger sticks out that way, and I see a lot of tension in there, and maybe that's slowing you down a little bit. Can't see it when you're doing it.
I can't let you go without asking about your main instrument, about I think it's in 1924?
For Lloyd
Loar, signed by Loar.
I could go get it. I realized I didn't bring it up here. It's just one floor down below. Could I do that? Or
yeah, I would love to, of course. Please.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Yeah, thanks.
So this is the sort of holy grail of mandolins. This shape, as you know, was invented by Gibson, and a particular man, Lloyd Loar, was working for the company in 1920, came up with the idea of F-holes. The earlier Gibsons had round holes. And changed the braces inside. Instead of one brace going across behind the oval hole, there are two braces inside this. And it's just really pretty special instrument. It's what Bill Monroe played, and so it's what most bluegrass players want to get a hold of. And most builders are trying to copy this when they build a mandolin, American style mandolin. I don't know if the light is probably better on it. You know, it was almost mint when I got it, mint condition. So I did all of that. I've had a few things done to it. I had it, there was a Verzi tone producer inside of it. In some of the mandolins, the Verzi company invented this thing. They really invented it for cellos to get rid of wolf tones, but they somehow sold the Gibson company on this idea. It was a piece of round spruce with two F-holes suspended from 3 feet from the face. And to me, it just weighed down the face and stopped it from vibrating. I think the idea was that they thought it would give it more resonance and more overtones. But we took that out, Todd Phillips and I, one full moon night. And then I later had John Monteleone, a great mandolin builder, regraduate the inside, the top and the back, mostly the back, He had been inside a lot of these instruments, and they vary from instrument to instrument. And he thought that it could use a little, the measurements were kind of off compared to other great Lloyd Loars that he'd had his hands on. So he made a mold and took the back off and took some wood out and took some wood out of the face and redid the tone bars. I also had the fingerboard elevated slightly so that I could get a higher bridge, so I could get a little more pressure on the top. That helped the sound a bit. I think that's about it. I think I took all the finish off the neck once because I didn't like how sticky it was. And if you feel it, I think that one of the coolest things about it is it's been played so much that you can feel the bumps in the grain.
Wow.
Because the dark parts of the grain are harder than the light parts. So it goes boom, 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 boom. And that's all me, I guess. So I've played it quite a bit.
There's even an audio recording,
But
I think 45 minutes,
Yes.
where it took the verse out. I've listened to it. Not all the 45 minutes, but it's great.
You're a maniac. Oh my God. Yeah, we thought we had to record that event. So this is a company I've been working with these days, Northfield, and they're doing great work. Man, these guys, these are just beautiful instruments. Look at that flame.
Wow, yeah.
They got it going on, and we're doing some different design things internally that are pretty spectacular, and they're fine. They have some great sources for wood, and I just love the company, and I love that they're able to produce something that's so good at this price range. You know, it's not $20,000 or $120,000. Like a Lloyd Loar. It's something, what are they, 6, 8, 9, something like that, depending on what features you get. And great company, great people. A lot of sustain. Strings are a little dead right now. This is pretty spectacular. It does some things that no other mandolin can do. Primarily, of course you can't probably hear it over the... It has this sort of very focused sound, very defined, fundamental on the note. The pitch is very centered. It's kind of dry. Not a lot of overtones. Probably because of the age of the wood. I mean, it's 2 years old now.
Wow.
No, 98 years old. 1924, February. So 97. And this one has more overtones. It's probably actually louder, the Northfield. Has a lot of sustain. So it's very interesting. When I'm playing acoustic with Katerina in a church, for instance, I'll actually prefer this one because of how it will project out into the room across. But if I'm in the studio with the microphone really close, there's this baby has the color, just the intimacy, and it'll also, you can also hear it in a track. It projects inside of a track if there are a lot of instruments really well because of simplicity of the tone, I think. It just sits there, right? Boom, I'm being a note. You can hear me.
But do you like traveling with it? I mean, it's quite an expensive instrument.
I prefer to have it with me than to not, you know, because then at least I know where it is. It's usually at my feet, on the airplane, in the taxi. You know, it's just sitting right there in the restaurant. I got my foot on it.
That's a good thing that the mandolin isn't that big. An upright bass player would have more problems in the airplane.
Right. So if I leave it at home and I'm not there, is it safe?